Russia's invasion of Ukraine has hit another deadlock. While Moscow strains for progress, Ukraine's forces are digging in and striking back on multiple fronts. Kyiv's growing confidence raises serious questions. What's driving their bold strategies, and why can't Russia seem to capitalize on its advantages? The answers reveal cracks in Putin's war machine and a looming turning point that could redefine this conflict. Let's dive in. We start with an overview. The first half of 2024 could have been considered the preparatory session for both Russia and Ukraine. While Russia mounted increasing pressure on the eastern front in Donbass, its relatively minor victories throughout the first 6 months of the year weren't noteworthy. In that time, Russia managed to occupy roughly 500 square miles of Ukrainian territory, a tiny amount of progress in a Ukraine where Russia already occupied 18% of the country. However, Russia was preparing to mount a summer campaign. The goal simple. Putin planned to put more pressure on the Kharkiv region, which is fairly far away from the hotly contested Donbass. If the Russian military presence was high enough, Ukraine would be forced to reallocate some of its resources from Donbass to defend Kharkiv. However, Russia made a series of mistakes when launching that summer campaign. The first of those was that its military seemed to be nowhere near prepared to mount a meaningful offensive in Kharkiv. The bulk of the strategy relied not only on long-range artillery, of which Russia has had a definitive advantage over Ukraine throughout the war, but also on infantry, and it wasn't even mechanized infantry squads supported by Russian tanks. No, Russia's plan for invading Kharkiv seemed to involve infantry on motorbikes plus makeshift turtle tanks. While the latter has tank in the name, the vehicles were actually scrapped armored vehicles reinforced with whatever metal Russians could find. These terrible substitutes for real tanks could barely attack and were instead used to divert and absorb Ukrainian fire. The result of the invasion was catastrophic. Ukraine didn't need to divert much of its forces from the eastern front. The offensive in Kharkiv was repeatedly repelled with mid-range weaponry, putting relatively little strain on Ukraine's defenses as compared to normal circumstances. Russia didn't manage to make any progress on either front and suffered around 70,000 casualties over the course of just 2 months, at a rate of roughly 1,200 casualties per day. This was a significant jump from the previous year's numbers, which fluctuated around 1,000 casualties per day, at least according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Then Ukraine unveiled its plans for the summer. At the start of August, a small contingent of Ukrainian soldiers entered the Russian region of Kursk. For the first time, Ukraine was the invading force, and Russia was in the unusual position of defending its own territory. This created a significant shift in the tide of the war to that point. The Kursk invasion was a resounding success, considering it only lasted 3 weeks. In those few weeks, Ukraine occupied roughly 500 square miles of Russian territory, the same amount of area Russia managed to occupy over the previous 7 months, exposing weaknesses in Russia's military along the way. As the Ukrainian soldiers advanced through Kursk, the Russian soldiers in the area swiftly retreated. If that option wasn't possible, they surrendered to the Ukrainians. According to reports from Ukrainian prisons that process prisoners of war, Ukraine captured close to 600 soldiers in Kursk. Out of those, it was estimated that as many as 80% were relatively fresh conscripts, and those conscripts had stories to tell. Interviews with new prisoners of war revealed just how bad the state of Russia's military was at the time. Some prisoners reported that they were given only a week or 2 of basic combat training before being transported to the front lines. For reference, basic combat training in the US lasts 10 weeks, and according to previous reports, it should last for between 4 and 8 weeks in Russia. The invasion of Kursk also resulted in the forced relocation of at least 200,000 Russian civilians. The Ukrainian government set up a military administration to oversee the occupied territory, and Zelensky boldly claimed that they would try to keep as much of Kursk as possible under their control throughout the rest of the war. To repel the invasion of Kursk, Russia merely relied on building trenches to try and stifle its opponent's progress. Ultimately, no real response came from anywhere within Russia's military for more than a month after the invasion started. It wouldn't be until September 10th, more than 5 weeks after Ukrainians first set foot into Kursk, that Russia would mount a counterattack into the region. More than a month later, on October 14th, Russia's Ministry of Defense announced that its forces had recaptured roughly 50% of the occupied territory. Of course, this is exactly what Ukraine was expecting to happen. Russia's counteroffensive required them to forego some of their vital supply lines on the eastern front, delaying its invasion deeper into Ukraine and buying Ukraine a bit more time. And time is what Ukraine needs most. With the invasion of Kursk called a resounding success by most strategists, Ukraine has managed to secure a significant moral victory over Russia. Shortly after the incursion began, the US and NATO countries announced more waves of financial and military aid to Ukraine. Among those was an additional Patriot anti-air missile system, which has proven to be among the most capable and valuable defensive systems Ukraine has gained access to. Considering that the US had only donated a single Patriot before that, an additional system is a significant increase in defensive potential. This would practically ensure that Russia but can't leverage its larger air fleet to control Ukrainian skies. Add to that the fact that the donated F-16s from a few European countries finally started flying in early August, and the invasion of Kursk has allowed Ukraine to secure a much more favorable position going forward. The invasion also presented yet another opportunity to trap Russia, this time diplomatically. A foreign power invading Russia's soil was one of Putin's red lines. Ukraine trampled on that red line alone. The Kremlin's initial responses to the Kursk invasion were muted at best, which gave NATO new opportunities to re-evaluate just how much help it can provide to Ukraine without risking nuclear war. Talk of the use of long-range missiles on Russian territory began, with that talk eventually turning into action. On November 18th, word began circulating that President Joe Biden had given Ukraine permission to use its long-range ATACMS to defend what it had taken in Kursk. Not long after that, similar permission came from the UK for the Storm Shadow missiles Ukraine had been stockpiling, and Ukraine wasted no time taking advantage. By November 19th, a mere day after receiving permission to use ATACMS, Ukraine had fired a volley of 8 of the missiles at an ammunition depot in the Bryansk region. More attacks followed. Ukraine confirmed it had used Storm Shadow missiles in Russia a day later, with senior sources in the country's military dubbing the strike very successful. The message to Putin was clear. Ukraine has long-range missiles, capable of traveling around 150 miles or so to Russian targets, and isn't afraid to use them. In truth, Ukraine had already offered hints that the West was softening on the use of its weapons in Russia. On September 10th, the same day that Russia announced its counteroffensive in Kursk, Ukraine launched one of its biggest and most ambitious long-range drone strikes into Russia's territory yet. The attack involved a total of 144 drones spread between various regions of Russia, with 20 of them going straight for the country's capital, Moscow. While most of those drones were shot down by Russian anti-air defenses, some managed to hit residential buildings, killing one person and causing flights to be diverted. However, you have to look at the big picture to understand the true value of the attack. The drone attack on Moscow was the first time that the Russian capital and its citizens had seen the effects of the war of Ukraine. Muscovites were relatively isolated from the war effort, or at least the true extent of it, thanks to the widespread Kremlin propaganda that the government has peddled ever since the so-called special military operation began. With Moscow exposed, Ukraine created an unfavorable situation for Putin. Previously, his reign was bolstered by the fact that the upper classes, particularly oligarchs, stood behind him and supported his expansionist agenda. That oligarchy support is now waning. A large portion of the drone strikes have been oriented not towards military compounds or cities, but oil refineries, which are scattered around Russia in its western regions. This might seem strange at first, considering that some of the largest deposits of Russian oil and gas are in Siberia. However, the oil refineries were set up in the west of the country so they could readily supply Europe with products. Russia has so far focused not on stockpiling oil, but on on-demand processing and delivery of it. This means that striking down oil refineries has severely impacted Russia's ability to export and make money off trade. Russia will struggle to sell these products either domestically or internationally. Both are important. US sanctions on Russian banks introduced in late November 2024 impact payments and transactions related to Russia's oil sales. They are made much harder with the sanctions in place. Add to this domestic struggles. If the Russians are unable to endure the harsh winter without the essentials, the morale and willingness of the entire population to keep fighting in the war will likely plummet. This can lead to repeats of anti-war protests popping up across the country. Returning to the oligarchs, it's also important to note how they are also likely to start working against Putin. Since the oligarchs built up their empires on their connections to the West, particularly via Russia's booming energy sector, these efforts have been pretty much annihilated by sanctions and trade bans. Oligarchs no longer have such a big voice in who trades with Russia. China, India, and Iran have become its closest partners, all of which have far more capability and opportunity to make demands. In fact, Putin has started going so far as to try and dismantle private companies. If his efforts bear fruit, he'll likely lose yet another pillar of support that has existed for decades. That could be enough to turn the oligarchs against him. Even though Putin can try to sustain Russia's economy on the backs of its new trading partners, that doesn't mean that they particularly like Russia staying in the war. China is the prime example. China has quickly risen as Russia's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade between the two nations reaching record highs in 2023 with $240 billion in trade. It has supplanted Europe as the biggest importer of Russian oil and gas, but the country has entrenched its geopolitics with Russia so much that it's now starting to feel the consequences. While China has helped Russia avoid Western sanctions by forwarding trade from other countries and using yuan and rubles instead of dollars, Western banks are starting to apply more pressure on their Chinese counterparts to stop working with Russian companies. As a result, nearly all banks have stopped processing payments from Russia. This can result in Chinese suppliers losing their money from Russian clients. Since Russia exports a large variety of products from China, from electronics and technology to industrial services, Severing these connections can cripple the country's manufacturing and service industries. If that happens, Russia will be in serious trouble. Imports vital to sustaining Russia's weapons industry may cease to arrive if China no longer accepts Russian money. Russia's booming energy sector from a few decades ago is now a severely stilted economy, one that relies on the energy sector working at peak efficiency to power everything else. When you combine these factors, there's a possibility that Russia's government will crumble from the inside out. China knows this, which is why it started trying to end the war. President Xi Jinping's outrageous first proposal includes Russia effectively being given full control of the territory it currently occupies in Ukraine. Zelensky won't accept that. But the existence of the proposal at all suggests China may align with the US in trying to push through peace. That brings us to another issue for Russia. Donald Trump won the November presidential elections. Now, President Trump previously indicated that he wanted to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of coming to office. That clearly hasn't happened, but we do know he has some kind of peace plan. We don't know the exact nature of that plan yet, at least not officially. But if rumors are true, the plan will involve the creation of an 800-mile buffer zone covering the war's front line that separates Kyiv and Moscow's soldiers. That line will be frozen, meaning Ukraine cedes the territory that's already lost, and it will be staffed by European NATO forces supplied by Britain, France, Poland, and others. Ukraine will also need to sacrifice its push for NATO membership for 2 decades. On the surface, that may seem like bad news for Ukraine, but Trump's peace plan would also put a greater strain on a Russian economy that's already almost wholly reliant on wartime production and a faltering energy sector. A ceasefire wouldn't grind that war machine to a halt immediately. Production would continue so Russia can replenish its lost stocks, but stopping the war would mean hundreds of thousands of soldiers returning to a country where little work is available, and the war economy is starting to end amidst interest rates being 21% and inflation standing at 9.5%. It's a perilous economic position for Putin and Russia to find itself in, with Trump's peace plan potentially exacerbating those issues. A short-term loss for Ukraine could evolve into a long-term collapse for Russia. Add the permission Ukraine now has to use long-range missiles against Russia into that mix, and Ukraine has a ton of leverage against Russia in any future peace talks. Through all that, Russia's ability to export oil and gas to China may drop, causing China to default to other exporters to make up the difference. Should that happen, China's position as Russia's biggest ally on the world stage might be called into question. Russia is only useful to China as a golden goose, exporting vital natural resources and keeping Western countries at bay militarily. If Russia's ability to do both of these things stops for any reason whatsoever, there's little motivation for China to maintain its relationship with them. Meanwhile, the other major country that's trading with Russia is becoming more pro-West as we speak. We're talking about India. India re-established the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, with Australia, Japan, and the US in 2017. The goal of the Quad is to limit China's evolving and growing presence in the Indo-Pacific, and India is a vital player there. Since India controls the western exit of the Strait of Malacca and a good chunk of the Indian Ocean, it can quickly become a blockade on China if things turn sour between the US and China. Furthermore, India has been growing its trade opportunities with Europe and the Middle East. The proposed Middle East corridor is meant to connect the EU with the Middle East and India by bypassing the Red Sea entirely. The corridor is considered to be a significant competitor to China's plans, namely the ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. The BRI's goal is to connect China with over 150 other countries and 30 international organizations. The most important parts of the program involve creating a land route between China and Pakistan, which would bypass India and its claims in the Indian Ocean. Then the route would go from Pakistan to the Middle East through the Arabian Gulf. This would give China access to Middle Eastern oil, while completely ignoring the stranglehold the US and India have on the Strait of Malacca. With the war in Ukraine raging for over 2 years and the COVID pandemic causing significant economic hardships before that, the BRI is nowhere near yielding any meaningful results for China. And so long as Russia is embroiled in a war with Ukraine, there's the risk that countries that might depend on China to be their largest trading partner could start turning towards the West as well. China also doesn't want Russia to lose the war with Ukraine because Putin could lose his seat as the head of state, as he's been the one tethering the two countries for the past decade. This means that China might start applying even more pressure on Russia to end the war by all means necessary, even though they are unable to siphon money or products into Russia as a result of sanctions. China now finds itself in a bind. Public support of Putin can only stretch so far when China is so reliant on Western trade. But with all that said, what is Russia doing to try and close out the war? Surprisingly, Russia is starting to get increasingly dependent on North Korea for support. North Korea has ended up being one of the largest suppliers of ammunition to Russia. South Korea suggests that North Korea has shipped 6,700 containers to Russia over the span of 6 months in late 2023 and early 2024. The containers could hold as many as 500,000 rounds of 122mm multiple rocket launcher ammunition. By some estimates, roughly half of Russia's artillery shells might actually be coming from North Korea. Russia has also cozied up to North Korea beyond purchasing weapons. The summer of 2024 saw the two countries sign a cooperative defense pact, which Russia is already using to its advantage. Between 11,000 and 12,000 North Korean troops have already been sent to Russia, with most taking part in a sustained counteroffensive against Ukraine in Kursk. While this might deepen the connection between the two countries and give North Korea far more real-world experience in military conflict, there's another question that should be on your mind. Why is Russia suddenly using North Korean troops? Recent reports from the battlefield might provide an answer. November 2024 was the worst month for Russia in terms of pure personnel losses since the beginning of the war. The country broke its own record for daily troop losses 3 times, culminating in breaking the 2,000 barrier, with 2,030 troop casualties on November 28th. Russia also recorded an average daily casualty rate of 1,523 in November, adding up to 45,680 soldiers lost in just 30 days. It was the 5th straight month in which Russia saw its casualty numbers rise. This has likely put a significant strain on the Russian military in terms of manpower. Reports from early 2024 suggest that Russia has signed close to 450,000 military contracts in the previous year. Yet, estimates from Russia analysis website Riddle suggest that the actual number of newly contracted soldiers entering the military might be as low as 200,000. This discrepancy can be explained by Russia using short-term military contracts for prisoners or volunteers, which can last as little as a few months. This can result in a single soldier signing multiple contracts in a single calendar year. Russia also fudges the numbers when it comes to its active military. It's currently processing around 300,000 recruits per year as part of its conscription. Those recruits' mandatory service lasts for a year before they have the option of signing a contract. But Russia is counting on these non-active personnel as active to make itself appear stronger than it really is. Add the reports that Russia has turned to using North Korean soldiers who have practically no experience in conflict of this scale, and you get a sign that Russia's situation is even more dire than it seems. Ukraine's capitalization on this, including using long-range missiles inside Russia, has led to Putin signing a new nuclear doctrine. That doctrine essentially gives Russia leeway to strike against Ukraine and any of its nuclear partners in response to any conventional attack Putin believes threatens Russia's sovereignty. Putin is very unlikely to use nuclear weapons. This doctrine change is more like a last throw of the intimidation dice as he realizes that Moscow itself is in danger, as is his entire country due to economic turmoil. As Zelensky has suggested, the next few months are likely to be vital for the war effort. For Russia, this might mean running out of options and being forced to accept a peace deal. But what do you think? How likely is the war to end in a few months, and who is the more likely winner? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching. Now go and check out The Myth of Russia's Powerful Military Destroyed, or click this other video instead.